Welcome, everybody. Transportation Live Fridays. This is a special show that we're doing every Friday at noon to talk about transportation, sustainable transportation, sponsored by Sustainable Transportation Vermont, with some of Vermont's leading thinkers and doers in the field of sustainable transportation. I'm broadcasting live from my house in Heinsberg, and our special guest today on Transportation Friday is Kelly Stoddard-Poor. Kelly is the Associate Director. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Richard.
Kelly is the Associate State Director of AARP, and we're going to talk about livable communities, safe streets, Vermont's downtowns, and some of the work that AARP has been a leader in this field. But first, Kelly, welcome and hope all is well with you and your household.
Thank you, Richard. We're doing well. We're safe here in Montpelier and love to see all of the new things that are popping up along our streets in response to COVID. And I'll talk a little bit more deeply about complete streets and then ways that we can think differently about how we're getting around in our downtowns and villages across the state.
Yes, no, and folks watching or listening are welcome to post comments, and Kelly's going to talk for a little bit and show some slides about some of her work, and then we will take questions and comments and have a discussion. But before we do that, I just want to say it's Vermont, and we've all done a variety of different things. And Kelly, I first knew you when you were working on tobacco control. So what is it between public health and what you're going to talk about today?
Oh, good question, Richard. I know Vermont's a small place like that. So I first started doing working for the American Cancer Society, working on tobacco control, healthy, active living, and transitioned over to AARP Vermont about 7 years ago. And I lead our work on livable communities, which is deeply tied to public health, transportation, aging in place. But if we are able to support and create livable communities, then we can all live healthier, longer lives. And I'll get a little bit more into some of those health benefits as I go through my slides.
Well, that's great. So let's turn right to that. So Kelly's going to walk us through her presentation, and then we're going to take questions and comments and have a discussion. So thanks again, Kelly. I'm going to turn it over to you now to tell us about livable communities.
Great. Thank you, Richard. All right. Hi, everyone. All right, so welcome, and I really just want to appreciate and thank Sustainable Transportation for inviting AARP to talk a little bit more about the work that we do on livable communities. So AARP's mission is focused on supporting older adults to be able to live high quality lives. And a big piece of living a high quality life is being able to choose where you live and be able to age successfully. And our livable communities work is really focused on how we can support active, healthy aging. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Many of you know the demographic trend that is happening across the country, and particularly here in Vermont. This is census data from 2010, and the blue areas represent the population 65 and older at over 21%. So you can see the blue areas, lots of green there, and then we'll shift to projected census data that we'll get for 2020. And you can see as the map darkens into darker blue, more of our population is aging. In Vermont, we're the second oldest state in the country, and we need to think about how we're supporting older adults to continue to be engaged and active in their community. And a big part of that is how our communities are structured. Next slide, please. So what we know is that the large majority of us want to be able to age in place. I don't think that comes to any surprise to anybody, is that you want to be able to age in a place where you are connected to your friends, your neighbors, and your community. But many of our housing, most of our housing stock is quite old in Vermont. A lot of it is inaccessible. Most of our housing has been built for able-bodied 35-year-olds, and many of our housing is in locations that are not easily accessible to services and amenities. Next slide, please. So about 80% of us, as I shared, want to be able to age in place. And but when we look around in our communities, a lot of them have not been built or designed to be able to support that type of aging in place. A lot of our communities, not all of them, of course, because we have a great fabric here in Vermont made up of our historic downtowns and our village centers. But when we see the sprawl that's happening and the inaccessible access to our streets and our sidewalks, make it more difficult to get to services, to amenities, and to be able to engage in public life. Next slide. So the next few slides I'm going to go through pretty quickly. This is just a nice slide to show you how we're getting around in our communities. This is from national data. So the majority of us are still getting around by car. But what is growing is the increased interest in biking. Boomers are actually driving that up significantly as they are going to biking more and more often. I like to tell the story of my in-laws who live over in Pittsford, Vermont, and they recently purchased e-bikes, and they're out biking every week, and they're running errands on their bike that they never would have done before because of the access to an e-bike. But looking at the reliance on the personal vehicle, and which is at 90% for millennials, 94% for boomers, and we need to think about how we're getting people around and offering different mobility options for people beyond the use of their personal vehicle. Next slide. And where do we want to live? So it's kind of spread out all over the place. We're looking at millennials, Gen Xers, baby boomers, and the silent generation. And rural small town is in the blue, and there is a desire to be in rural small towns across the state. Go ahead, next slide, please. And this slide here just shows what types of amenities people want in their community. They want to have access to a bus stop nearby. They want to be able to go to the grocery store and to a park that is in close proximity. Those are really important amenities, and people make those decisions when they're purchasing a house or they're looking to downsize from their existing home. And so when we think about what a community offers, we want to think about those important amenities that draw people in. Next slide. And this is just a nice slide because I think we often put boomers and millennials in two different categories, and there's a lot of similarities between what boomers and millennials want. They want to be able to have access to restaurants and to dining, being able to go out, and they would trade off a smaller home for a shorter commute. And those are really two important points, and I don't think that those will change drastically, although we will have to think differently of how we engage in public life as our economy starts to open back up during COVID. Next slide. So why a livable community matters. It provides the network and the mobility that people need to be able to stay independent. It also breaks down barriers and reduces risk for isolation when people are able to engage in social, civic, and economic life in their community. Next slide. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail around complete streets, because when we think about the mobility, it varies across an individual's ability, where they're at in their life, resources that are available, but we know that people enjoy walking, and that is the most preferred mode after driving your own personal vehicle to getting around, is that people want to be able to walk to places. And AARP back in 2011 pushed forward on complete streets legislation, passing that statewide legislation supporting complete streets. And this is really about how we can increase mobility for people of all ages and all ability. Next slide. So Complete Streets is about looking at our roadways. It does not address, our highways, 89 or 91, and it doesn't apply to dirt roads either. But it applies to all other roadways. And if new roads are being built, or if a road goes under construction, the engineers that are involved need to consider all users of the road. And so that includes motorists, pedestrians, bicyclists, and those who are using public transit as well. And so really thinking critically about how our roads serve all users. And that is the lifeline in our communities and through our downtowns and our villages, is to be able to provide that connectivity for people to get to places. Next slide, please. So just to the piece on Complete Streets, and Richard had asked me earlier the connection between Complete Streets and public health, and Complete Streets provides that mobility for those who are no longer driving. 1 in 5 older adults over the age of 65 no longer drives, and it is really important that they stay connected to their community and are able to get to places like doctor's appointments, to go see a friend, to go to the pharmacy, to go to the grocery store. And Complete Streets allows that because it looks at different ways for people to be able to get around. It also addresses climate change, as it helps to reduce individual use of motor vehicles. Land use, it supports compact development in our downtowns and village centers, and it supports public health in the way that it allows people to be able to engage in more healthy, active living by biking and walking places. And the economic vitality is really important. When we think about our downtowns and our villages and supporting the local economy and bringing people there on foot traffic is so critical to supporting our local economy. Next slide. So a couple of key pieces around Complete Streets. Reducing speed is really important. So one of the things that I always hear from our members when we go out and do walk audits is that what is preventing people from walking places or biking places is that they feel unsafe. And that is because the street is not accommodating all users of the road. And speed is a big deterrent for people to be able to go places. And that is across the age spectrum. That applies to young children all the way up to older adults. If people are speeding and flying down roads, you don't feel safe walking, and you certainly don't feel safe crossing the street. So ways that you can reduce speed, on-street parking is a great way in our downtowns. It's able to help slow down traffic. The more activity you have on the street, and the cars are forced to go at a slower speed. Next slide. And I'm going to stay on this reducing speed topic for a couple more slides. So narrowing a travel lane. So a lot of our rural roads obviously can't accommodate a sidewalk. One, the maintenance and the investment would be too expensive. So thinking about ways how you can really leverage the space and bring in those fog lines and provide more safety along those lanes, and being able to reduce the travel lane for the car can also help reduce those speed limits as well. Next slide. And then going through the process of reducing the speed limit within your downtown or village center is also another great way to help get vehicles to slow down, because then that speed limit can then be enforced. And both Burlington and Winooski have taken that approach of instituting a 25-mile-per-hour speed limit through their downtowns. Next slide. So some bike strategies, thinking about protected cycle tracks, separating a bicyclist from the ongoing traffic is really important. It provides a real sense of safety, and it also provides more awareness for the motorists to be able to see the bicyclist. And people feel more protected if there is any type of barrier between the bike lane and the traffic on the road. Next slide. Bulb outs are a great way to help also reduce speed and increase safety for crossing the road. We don't need signalized intersections at every intersection, but ways that we can draw attention to those who are crossing the street. Bulb outs are a great way, or sometimes known as curb extensions, where it gives the driver more visibility of the pedestrian when they're crossing the street, because they're able to step out within that bulb out and the motorists can see them when they're going to cross the street. It's a great way to also help narrow the roadway through those intersections, helping to then also slow down traffic. Next slide. Right sizing the roads. Sometimes this is also called a road diet. Not my favorite terminology, but right sizing is very technical. So a lot of people don't necessarily know instantly what you're talking about. But many of you might be familiar with the project up in the New North End in Burlington along North Ave, where 4 lanes were taken and reduced down to accommodate all users of the roads. So better service for those who are using the bus, GMT running up and down North Ave corridor, those who are walking and crossing the street, and a bike lane along North Ave as well. So taking those 4 lanes, reducing it down to 1 lane on each side, and then having a turning lane it reduces accidents, it helps slow down traffic, and provides and accommodates for more users of the road. Next slide, please. Public transit. Always think about how you can connect your roadway to public transit, and thinking really critically about these services, or I should say the amenities that are provided at bus stops, particularly bus stops that are frequented. So thinking about making sure that there's a place for a bike rack if people if they're biking there, make sure that the bus shelter is actually connected to a sidewalk so people can walk to the bus shelter. One of the things that we always hear from our members when we put out surveys about barriers of why is it difficult to ride the bus, and one of them is always about shelter, or having a place to sit while you wait for the bus is really important. So we can't make all of those investments at all bus stop locations, but the ones that are really busy, it's really important that we make those investments. It makes riding the bus a lot safer, and it also provides that comfort and appeal for people. Thank you. Next slide, please. So these are just some slides just showing complete streets in action. You've got up in the top corner, that is Norwich into Hanover and the bike lane going across the bridge there. And then in the bottom left corner, you've got Jericho downtown, putting in a sidewalk. And then over on the right, you've got a nice rural road that has instituted a nice shoulder with using the fog line there, and that's out in Cornwall. All right, next slide, please. So I just want to transition a little bit into the importance of public spaces and how we think about how our streets connect to and support public life. And that is really important when we think about our streets as public space, right? It's actually our largest public good. And thinking about how we make our streets and all public spaces more accessible, comfortable, and we provide activity and opportunity for socialization. And we'll have to think differently around our public spaces as we move into reopening up of public life and providing more space for people to be able to social distance. And that will be really critical. And we have to think about how we're using our streets to be the most valuable during this crisis. And there'll be a lot of new and interesting ways where we can reallocate underutilized public spaces for people to be able to move around. Next slide, please. So getting people to be able to move around is really important. And as AARP had championed Complete Streets back in 2011, one of the things that we have found is that some people are nervous about instituting and investing in a Complete Streets project, but ways that we can test that work and find opportunities for people to experience what Complete Streets is all about is a great chance for people to think differently about how we're using our streets. And the left-hand pictures are from Bethel when we did a demonstration project there several years ago, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some simple solutions that can be taken to reimagine and repurpose our streets. Next slide, please. So for those familiar with the concept of placemaking, it's about reinventing and re-engaging public spaces so that people have a place to be able to connect and engage in civic and social and economic life. And there's so many public spaces that can be reimagined and reinvented to fulfill those purposes. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the low-cost things that you can do for high impact around placemaking. And so thinking about how you can reallocate the public space, as our streets are known as public spaces, for other purposes beyond driving. And this is a picture here of a parklet, so repurposing a parking space to provide outdoor dining or spaces for people to sit and rest along the way. So next slide, please. So this is just, I want to go quickly through this project that we did on down in Bethel, which was a weekend-long demonstration project. We had partnered up with the community there to reimagine how the street could be reactivated to help support economic, social, and civic engagement. Next slide. This is a video that we'll probably send the link out to later because I think we're running a little bit out of time. So we'll go ahead and skip that slide. So here you can see the way that we re-envisioned the street here. So we took 2 lanes, we took parking off of one side of the lane, kept it on the other side, created a multi-use lane on the left there. We called it the blue lane because it was multi-use and that anybody could go on it. And it's really good for accessibility, because for those who are using assisted mobility devices like a wheelchair or a walker, or pushing a stroller, it's really difficult sometimes to navigate the ups and downs on a sidewalk and the cracks, particularly if you're pushing a walker, the cracks in between the sidewalks, and the street is seamless. So we did that. We put a protected a protection in there for folks, and then we did some bulb outs, temporary bulb outs on the crosswalks, and then did a parklet as well. And I've got a couple of other pictures that go a little bit more into detail of some of the changes we did. So there's a picture of the blue lane. We used temporary paint, put in straw wattles to provide the protection there. Next slide. And another great image, we had some e-bikes for people to be able to test out, which is always a really fun experience to see people getting back on a bike that they hadn't been on in several years. Next slide. And this is a picture of the parklet. So reallocating 2 parking spaces and providing a pop-up taco bar there, which they sold out of tacos the first and second day there, but it really stimulates economic activity as well. Next slide. And this might be a little hard to see, but we put in a temporary pedestrian island to help slow down some of the traffic. There's a lot of truck traffic coming in, a lot of logging trucks, and getting those, and they're coming down on an incline. So getting them to slow down with that temporary pedestrian island was a great way to help people feel safer when they're crossing the street. Next slide. And then just those the bulb outs that we did with the straw wattles and some plantings, and then providing some more visual aid to the crosswalk themselves. Next slide. And providing a temporary bus shelter for people who were using Stagecoach, the local transit provider there in Bethel. People really valued that. The bench was already there, and we just put temporary covering over that. Next slide, please. And just some of the direct outcomes, we reduced speed limits over this demonstration project pretty drastically. They were at about 27, which wasn't too high, but getting them down to 15 made a real big difference in a small village center. Next slide. This shows the decibels. So it was really quite loud with a lot of the traffic, and that was up at 80. And then through the weekend, we tested it multiple times, and it was down at 40, which is like quiet library. So it really, you can think about how much more enjoyable it is to be out on the sidewalk, whether or not you're dining or you're shopping or you're just sitting along taking a rest. It becomes a much more inviting place. Next slide. And just, this work is really important, and engaging and involving the community from the very beginning is so critical to all of this work, because they're the ones who know what's best in their community. And it's all about really maximizing the existing assets that are in a community, and making sure that you involve the community throughout the process is really important. Next slide. And keep the momentum going. Sometimes change can take a long time to get started, but just building on it is really important, and getting community feedback along the way helps you continue to grow your work and your projects. Next slide, please. And I just think that this is really important, that we continue to challenge outdated beliefs, spark new solutions so that more people can choose how they live and how they age, and that transforming society is the work of all of us. And we have a lot of work to do. So next slide. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today, Richard.
Kelly, that was fabulous. Really, really, really substantive and interesting. And to actually have that case example, that story study, really brings it home. And it makes me think of a couple of things. One, a lot of our towns and villages, which in some ways we're really talking about here, how we can make those communities walkable, make the streets safer for all users, as you said. But often there's state roads that run through them. In the case of Bethel, did you have to get special permission? Is that a state road? Do you remember any of that part of it?
Great question. No, it's a really important question. And I should have brought that up earlier, so I'm glad you brought it up. Is that so in some cases, the downtowns or the villages have jurisdiction over the state highway that runs through their town, which it makes it so much easier for them to be able to test these types of things out, because they have local control over the state highway. And in the case of Bethel, they had that. So it made things much easier. VTrans was actually extremely helpful during the process. They came out with their spray rig and helped us paint the temporary multi-use lane, instead of us rolling it with a paint roller. They came out with their striper and did that for us. So they're extremely helpful in the process, but you're allowed to do much more when the town has the jurisdiction over the state highway. And VTrans has a white paper out that sort of walks towns through the process of taking over the state highway that runs through their village or downtown center.
That's great, because that in the past, and we're in a new era with people who are thinking much more, as you said, differently about all these things. But that used to be one of the big challenges, is that some of these seem odd to people who have built a career about building roads that are really designed for cars and to move cars safely. And to move cars safely, you need wide streets, straight streets. And, for example, in the town I live in Heinsberg, there's been some debate about painting a crosswalk. And because it is a state highway, 116, we had to get permission and approval. And so I'm glad to hear you're thinking that some of those challenges may be going away.
I think so. And I particularly think as we think about how we get around in our community, and that's changing as we age, right, as well, and different desires that people have. They want to be able to, people love walking, and most people want to be able to walk more, but they don't feel safe doing it. And so finding ways that we can make our streets more accessible and more inviting and comfortable for people to get around in different ways is so important. And it really helps stimulate the local economy too. And I think Chris Cole always said that, like, cars don't buy things, people do. So we need people to get out of their cars and, visit our downtowns and our village centers. And they need safe ways to do that.
So this is Sustainable Transportation Vermont sponsored Transportation Live Fridays, and people are welcome to post questions or comments. And it's really cool because John Kaplan, who actually works at the Agency of Transportation, has written us a note pointing out that there is going to be guidance from VTrans on how more communities may be able to do just the kind of demonstration project you just showcased us in Bethel. And one of the things that really struck me about that project is how inexpensive. I mean, yes, there's probably lots of time and planning and thinking that went into it, but in the end of the day, you're talking about paint, and in your case, because you were testing the bulb outs, but you weren't actually building them, hay bales. Is that what you said?
Yep. Easy.
Some of these solutions, or another one that you mentioned about taking the fog line that's on the side of a rural road and just making sure, possibly bringing it in a little so that the travel lane is 9 feet, maybe you said. And then that gives a little more space on that roadside for the biker or the walker.
Yes, that's right. There's some really simple solutions, ones that don't cost a lot of money. I think when we're thinking about big, municipal planning grants that could, completely change the streetscape of the downtown, rightfully some community members get nervous. And so being able to test things out and pilot them first and get community feedback is really important to be able to, I think, make a project successful. And as you said, Richard, some of these elements can be really affordable. And a lot of times you might not get it right the first time, but you can improve upon it and build upon it and make it better, and bring the community along through that process is so important.
And I also want to underscore what you said about design. For a long time, we thought you could post a speed limit and make people drive slower, but the roads, we know, are designed to send a signal to the driver that certain speeds are safe. And so in some places in this world, they're actually taking away some of the signs because it makes the drivers more cautious just automatically. And so this whole idea of designing a road that's a little narrower, more sidewalk or bike path, or the bulb outs, what do we call them?
Yep.
All of that just sends a signal to the car to drive slower, which makes it a more pleasant experience for that person sitting on the bench or walking on the sidewalk.
Absolutely, or crossing the street too, right? So absolutely, if we can design our roads and get them to get drivers to slow down, that's a huge win.
So one other thing I've been thinking about, has been coming up a little bit in these talks, is that we're in this amazing moment and people are working from home much more than they ever did. And not only people, but employers are finding that it works for their employees. Do you see anything in this moment around telecommuting or work from home that relates to all this that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to think about how our streets and other public spaces could be repurposed as our economy is starting to open back up, and providing space for outside dining, for shopping, for public life where people can safely socially distance. And I think parklets are a great way to provide that extra space for that business. And so repurposing one parking space to help the economy and to help bring back public life, I think, is a great way. And there's, during this crisis, like, we want to do more than just survive it, right? And we want to find those opportunities. And I know that when I've been out every day walking and biking, I see more and more people in my community walking and biking, and I think there'll just be a more increased desire for people to get around like that.
What do you think is the single, again, a lot of your work, it feels like, is about showing how it can be done and working with communities to partner with them. But from a state point of view, what are the public policies? You said complete streets was one that you really pushed for, but what public policies are there that the state of Vermont could really implement to move livable community initiatives forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously Complete Streets, we've been working with the Department of Housing and Community Development to support a new program called Better Places, which would be a crowdfunding program to help support local projects to get up and going. And that would be a public-private partnership, and so that's an initiative that we've been supporting. And then VTrans is going through the process of updating their state standards, which also will help provide better guidance for road design and opportunities for towns to implement different design features. So those are some of the larger sort of policy pieces. And I think, also the health and all policies that we have already in place in Vermont is also another really important piece where we think about the public health impact that all of our policies have.
One of our questioners pointed out that for these part of what we're talking about is enabling people to live in places where we're living closer together.
Mm-hmm.
And yet at the same time, I'm reading in the real estate, what's happening potentially is people from urban areas with resources are looking at moving to places like Vermont, but out into rural country settings. Do you think
Mm-hmm.
about that at all, and what might we be doing in this moment?
Yeah, that's a big one. The housing piece is a really important component to this, and thinking about land use, right, and the connection between transportation and our housing. And we do need more housing, and we need a variety of housing types. So I think for towns, it's an opportunity to update their zoning, and to allow for more housing, a variety of housing types that could be in the walkable downtown or village center radius. Uh, and I'm not trying to dodge your question, Richard, around the real estate piece, because people have the choice to move out to a rural setting if they want to. But I think if we can provide a variety of housing options, some of those other housing options will be more appealing. And just one other policy that we've been prioritizing too over the last few years is the ability for homeowners to build accessory dwelling units, either converting their single family home to do an internal conversion of an ADU, or allowing for the ADU to go in their backyard. We have state legislation for that, but some local ordinance that makes it easier is another good policy.
So that would allow more density in our downtowns.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and not changing the character of neighborhoods either, right? Like the addition of an ADU would provide slightly more density, but it doesn't change that overall character or feel of a neighborhood when you have either the ADU being the converted internal conversion, or the addition of that in the backyard. So, but it provides more housing, it provides opportunity for home sharing, lots of opportunities with ADUs.
Do you think about minimum parking standards at all? Does that come?
Yeah, that's an important piece, and I think the parking one is always controversial, right? And we encountered this when we were working with the city of Burlington and our partners over at HomeShare, pushing forward for an update on the ADU ordinance in Burlington, and was to remove the parking minimum requirement for the ADUs. So because a lot of the parking requirements are just become a hindrance for any type of development. So thinking more thoughtfully about that. And I know the Department of Housing and Community Development is going to be coming out with some updated zoning guidelines, and parking will be addressed in that. So some, incremental approaches that communities can take to be able to support housing and more walkable, livable communities.
You've mentioned at least 3 different state agencies: health, transportation. Do you think we do a better job in Vermont? Do we do a decent job in Vermont of communicating across those agencies when all these policies seem to have, related impacts?
I do. I think we do a really good job. I think that our state agencies are open to collaborating. They talk to one another. And I work on it. There's a number of different work groups that I'm part of, and a number of state agencies are around the table. And I think we all have the similar goal in mind, and just coming at it from slightly different angles.
We have one question from somebody Bruce from Southern Vermont, I think he is, about, have you seen any of this where we read elsewhere, street closings
Mm-hmm.
to allow people to ride, to sort of show, I guess, illustrate what it could be like?
Absolutely. And I like to call it street openings, because we're opening up the street for people. And so, because I feel like closing sounds negative, but we're seeing cities and towns across the country do this. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about how we can open up our streets for more healthy, active living, for people to be able to walk and bike safely is just an excellent idea. And you can try it out. You could try it out over a weekend, see how it goes, and then try it out longer, and then, get it to become more permanent. And, Church Street's a great example of, a street that opened up to public life. So.
Yeah, this might be out of the blue for you, but as you look around Vermont, you mentioned some examples. Do you see other places, other towns and villages in Vermont that are doing some interesting, innovative things, or highlight a couple that you know about? I mean,
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
So I'd love to do a shout out for Brattleboro. They're doing a lot of great work down in Brattleboro, and they have been building upon it year after year to increase pedestrian and bike safety. You know, they've got two state routes that come through their downtown. So they've done a lot of things to enhance safety, comfort, and appeal for people who wanting to walk and bike. But last year, we provided a small mini grant to the downtown organization, and Stephanie Bonin led a really great project there to activate the alleyway between their transit center and the shops and restaurants next door. That was not a very inviting place for people, but yet was so important for people to be able to pass through if they're parking in the garage or catching a bus somewhere. And they just did some really fun, interactive placemaking pieces there, and they're building on it and, you know, trying to make it more permanent. And there's some really great energy down there, and a lot of artists that have been involved in the process, making it a really creative piece, and reflective of the community itself. So
Yeah. Do you, by the way, where is the best place? Maybe you said this earlier. If a town or village wants to kind of learn from each other, see great examples, where would you go?
that's a good question, Richard. Where all of that lives. You know, that is probably one thing all of our like AARP included and our partners around the table probably haven't done the best job of making a one-stop place to see everything. But I would say most likely it would be the Department of Housing and Community Development, looking at the downtown village designation. There's a lot of great resources on there, and also just this new effort that we're trying to get passed through the legislature, Better Places, that also has got some great examples of some good placemaking work that's happening across the state. So I would probably say that's probably where the best examples you can find there.
Well, stay tuned. We've been in touch with people from that office about coming in and giving a presentation here from the downtown. I forget what its official title is, but the place where we designate downtowns and really help. Yeah. The Richard Amore, maybe is it?
Yes, Richard's great. He's great, and he's got some great images to show and to really inspire people. Richard and Gary over there they're fantastic. So,
Kelly, anything else AARP is doing we should know about or support your work in some way here at Sustainable Transportation Vermont?
Sure. I would just like to put a little plug in. We launched a program called Community Connections during the height of the shutdown through COVID. And this is really about addressing some of the social isolation that a lot of our older adults are facing across the country. But it's a great local resource as well. So you can go on to AARP.org/coronavirus, and you'll see a link for Community Connections. And there's just it's a great resource to be able to connect with loved ones, or if folks are looking to connect with their mutual aid group in their community, being able to have a friendly phone call if people are feeling isolated and lonely. And I know that's a little off topic from sustainable transportation, but when we think about people's mobility and current circumstances have really reduced our mobility, and making sure that people stay connected in other ways, and we can be able to reduce social isolation during all of this. So,
yeah, thank you for saying that. I'll never forget, once I worked for the U.S. Census, and my job was to go around knock on doors in Vermont. And it was just such a reminder of what we know numbers wise. There's just a lot of people living alone who are lonely.
Yeah. And aren't leaving their home, right? Like,
Right.
And so making sure that, if you have a neighbor or a loved one that needs to, just wants to have a friendly phone call with somebody, or chat online with a group, there's lots of different connections that the community connections can make for individuals to feel connected again.
Kelly, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Brianna's going to pop up here and tell folks what's next. And then we will post that link that, oh, somebody already did, Kelly, post a link to the community connection. So Brianna, come tell us what's going to be next week. I think it's related to, a whole different topic. Brianna, hop in and say something if you'd like.
Hello, everyone. Next week, our speaker is going to be Brian Collier, and he's going to be talking about mowing lawns and how the simple thing of not mowing your lawn can be really effective for the environment. So tune in next Friday at 12, June 5th, and we hope to see you there.
Thanks again, Kelly.